Today marks day 970 of the war in Ukraine, a war that Putin and frankly many in the West also fought, that would last just 3 days. We've been through sieges, blockades, referenda, counteroffensives, and more recently the incursion into Russian territory. So it's a war that's never been predictable, and it's never failed to surprise us. But in the context of polycrises and global instability, the Israel-Hamas war, election cycles, both the news and public consciousness seems increasingly fatigued with the war. And some voices are calling for peace, a negotiated settlement to end the aggression and save lives. Others are arguing that this is actually short-sighted thinking. And peace now would only risk further war and more conflict in the long run, because it would allow Russia to regroup and attack Ukraine and maybe even countries beyond Ukraine in the Baltics specifically. So the question is, what now? What is the endgame in Ukraine? And answering it, we'll have a brilliant panel, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak, starting with Jacob Reynolds, who is the head of policy at MCC Brussels. It's a think tank challenging EU ideas and narratives. And he's also an associate fellow at the Academy of Ideas. Secondly, we got Mary Dejevsky, who is a writer and broadcaster, and primarily works for The Independent, but also writes for other outlets. She's also been foreign correspondent in Moscow, Paris, Washington, and a special correspondent in China. And last, we have Bruno Waterfield, who is the Brussels correspondent for The Times. Jacob, take it away.
Thanks. When trying to think and grapple with the conflict, the thing that never ceases to amaze me is kind of the, I'd say, misplaced certainty that people talk about issues related to the conflict with. And you hear a tremendous amount of what seem to me to be wild assertions on both sides of the debate. And so I think any discussion of the war has to kind of come back, think a little bit from first principles and stake out the kind of fundamental territory of the debate. And so that's broadly what I want to do today. At the fundamental level, there's a duality that's at stake in the war that is both very straightforward, very simple, but also is intractable and leads the conflict to a kind of dynamic of insolvability. It's difficult to see how the war can end. And this is basically that, on the one hand, Russia desires an end to Ukrainian sovereignty, perhaps even an end to Ukraine as an entity as such. And on the other hand, Ukraine will not surrender its sovereignty and considers the war existential. All of the difficulties of bringing the war to an end stem from these two unassailable facts. When these two positions are the red lines for negotiations, it's relatively obvious how neither side can reach an agreement. Now, instead of proceeding from these basic facts, the debate, and this is as true among people who style themselves as critics of NATO or critics of the West, but also people who are our leaders and the leaders of NATO and of Western countries, instead of recognizing these two facts, the debate is very much characterized by a series of delusions, and I want to tackle these delusions. The first delusion is that Ukraine doesn't need to carry on fighting. And this delusion has been the central assumption of both Western and anti-Western foreign policy since the first day. We all remember how the Americans hoped Zelensky would take the offer of an airlift and leave Ukraine to fall into Russians' hands when the invasion started. And I also remember very well all of those who positioned themselves as pro-peace figures who immediately demanded, when the war broke out, Ukraine's surrender because they said they had Ukraine's best interests at heart. And this delusion that Ukraine doesn't need to carry on fighting basically is the assumption that there's nothing at stake in the conflict. And this rests on the fact that people on both sides don't really believe that national sovereignty is either real or is worth fighting for. Related to this delusion is the suggestion that the prospect of a peace deal makes the fighting unnecessary. So it doesn't need to carry on fighting because there's a peace deal. And I think you'd only have to look at what any kind of deal might be to see how untrue this proposition is. So even if Ukrainians were prepared to stomach the loss of territory that Russia has captured, even if they were prepared to stomach an end to NATO prospect or an end of some kind of security guarantee from the West, any deal even then that would be, or is talked about being put forward by Russia, would still represent a complete end to Ukrainian sovereignty, not least on one of the big things that rarely gets talked about, but seems to be one of the fundamental things that Putin would insist on, is discussions related to the size of Ukraine's army, for example. Basically, a demand that Ukraine would never better defend itself again. So a demand of subjugation. The second delusion I want to tackle is the idea that Russia can be negotiated with. And I mean, one of the most common things you'll hear Ukrainians say about any possible peace deal, as alluded in the introduction, is, well, what stops Russia from invading us again? And I think many Westerners kind of find this response surprising because we're used to maybe a slightly different era. We're also used to a land of contracts and agreements, and even war is kind of seen as something of a transaction. You stop, you agree the war, you agree to end, and everybody moves on with their lives. Now, there might once in recent history have been a Russia to which this kind of mentality applied, but it certainly does not apply now. The explicit ideological and increasingly the social project of Putinism rests on completely contrary features. First, the creation of a great Russia with, at its core, Russia, importantly Ukraine, and also Belarus, but perhaps only as a starting point. And the second part of the project of Putinism is explicit confrontation with the West. And these features have only become more and more entrenched by the war. The Russia of today is not the Russia of yesterday. And so whatever the short-term outcome of the war, a Russian retreat, a ceasefire, the recognition of Russian gains, etc., this is only the first stage of a new antagonistic relationship between Russia and the West. Now, the third delusion is perhaps the most surprising. The third delusion is that the West supports Ukraine. It might be something of an exaggeration, but the West supports Ukraine only long enough to ease its guilty conscience, only enough to stem the tide, to hold on, but never enough to put Ukraine in a dominant position. And you don't need to be a geopolitics expert to recognize this truth. Indeed, there are plenty of videos of Ukrainian soldiers saying the same thing for the last 2 years. And so Ukraine is assigned an impossible position in world politics. It depends on its survival on the West, who cannot be depended on. Now, in view of the widespread adoption of these delusions, what is Ukraine supposed to do? And I'd rather turn the question around. It's the widespread adoption of these delusions that makes Ukraine's actions seem incomprehensible. Once you reject the delusions, once you reject the idea that there's nothing at stake in the conflict, once you reject the idea that Russia can in any meaningful sense be negotiated with, and once you reject the idea that the West really supports Ukraine, then Ukraine's actions become a lot more comprehensible. They fight because they have to, and they'll fight and they'll stop only when they can't carry on fighting. When that point comes, which is a live topic of discussion of Ukraine, when can they no longer carry on? That's a question we have to leave to Ukraine to decide.
Thanks. Mary?
Well, thank you very much for giving me this platform, because I think that it's very important that other views other than the really strong prevailing consensus, especially in this country, they need to be challenged. And they need to be challenged from several perspectives. And in a way, I've just been given a way in to challenge exactly those perspectives. And they chime so well with the talking points that I had prepared that I'm actually going to address those points and what were called the delusions, one by one. The first is that I think that the premise of the war, what drove Russia to invade Ukraine, and I will say at the outset that I think that the invasion of Ukraine was totally, totally wrong. But the reasons have, I think, been completely misinterpreted, and including from this platform already, that the reason is basically Russia's and Putin's great power complex, that Russia can only continue or be restored as a great power if it reincorporates Ukraine, and that what Russia wants is, and Putin wants, is the end of Ukrainian sovereignty or even the end of Ukraine itself. Now, my response to that is to say, okay, fine, but what was Putin doing from 2000, when he became president of Russia, until 2022, when the invasion happened? And the answer was that until 2014, Ukraine had enshrined in its post-Soviet constitution that it was a neutral country. It was when that neutrality was dropped, and that happened in 2014, and it was courted very aggressively by both the European Union and NATO from that year onwards, in fact from 2013. And that the rationale, Putin's rationale for the invasion was not a great power complex. It was about Russia's security. And Russia saw its security threatened, not just by the advance, as it saw it, of NATO towards its own border, but the use that Ukraine's westward orientation was being put by the West, specifically by the United States and NATO, which was to install Western military, it was training and equipment and advisors in Ukraine, which Russia saw as an existential threat. And that means when we get on to the discussion of Russia won't negotiate, Russia will negotiate, but it will negotiate from a premise that its security is at risk, that it wants security guarantees. And it's all very well for Ukraine to say it won't stop the war without security guarantees from the West. But the war will not stop, from Russia's point of view, without Russia getting security guarantees. And I know that people laugh and they say, no, Russia is this huge, strong country. It's a great power. It's a superpower. Russia is a weak country. It's a country that has been shorn of the empire it had under the Soviet Union, under the empire. It is fearful, and fear is a much greater motivation of what seems like a ridiculous project of invading the neighbouring country. Fear is a much stronger motivation than any sort of great power ambition. And that's what has to be addressed in any negotiations and any solution to this. Do you want to... Is that the end of that? Okay.
It's really important to realise with this conflict and with Ukraine is how it's changed everything. It's actually changed the world. It's actually changed geopolitics. I work in Brussels, Brussels correspondent, and I remember really, really well in February 2022 when Russia invaded, and everybody thought it was going to be over in a matter of days or weeks. That was the absolute prevailing wisdom. The Americans, everybody. So all these the sinister NATO militarists were absolutely convinced, Kiev would fall a matter of days or weeks. There was only one country that didn't hold that outlook, and it was Britain. Ben Wallace, the then defence secretary, and he said, "No, the Ukrainians will fight back. You watch. It won't be over in days or weeks. Ukraine wants Ukrainian sovereignty is real." And I remember a German official. He'd said this at NATO. And I remember a German official say to me, "Oh well, it's a Brexit delusion. He's delusional. His mind has been addled by Brexit. He's convinced that national sovereignty is that real that Ukraine can survive." It's really important to remember that in April 2022, Russia abandoned
its attempt to take Kiev. It abandoned its attempt to essentially destroy Ukraine as an independent state. Actually, having neutrality in your constitution because your large, powerful neighbour demands it is not being an independent, sovereign nation state. So it's really interesting it's very important to realise that Ukraine has overturned, along with Israel in many ways, the dominance in international relations of the so-called realism. And the realist doctrine is that, a small country like Ukraine cannot stand up to a big country by military means, basically surrender. It's kind of a cynical defeatism, if you like. Ukraine has overturned that in geopolitics. It is no longer certain that the weak country will always fold. It is no longer the rule of international relations that might ends up being right. The dial has shifted. It's really important to realise that when Putin invaded Ukraine, and we don't really know why he did it then, but a big factor, I think, and I know this is arguable, is that it came after the fall of Kabul. And it came after the fall of Kabul when there was a real perception across the world, rightly actually, that the West was weak. It was disorganised. It couldn't hold the line. And I think it's all important for us to note that the West is still weak. The moral malaise very much still remains in the West, and the Ukraine conflict hasn't really changed, for example, the realism of Germany and the sort of nationalism and desire to maintain national sovereignty of the Poles. That kind of fault line still runs through the West, like the word Brighton in a stick of rock. So there is a cynical debate going on at the moment, particularly in Brussels, about the importance of changes in the White House, the prospect of Trump coming, because again it's this realism. It's if the US wants it to be over, it will be over. That's the reality of international relations, and I think there is an element there because of truth, because there is an element by which the US is instrumentalizing, it's using the Ukraine conflict for its own national interests. I mean, that's what countries do, after all. And, perhaps they don't have the kind of principled moral attachment to Ukraine's national sovereignty that actually Europeans should have, because the principle of national sovereignty is one that, America has not been a great friend of throughout the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. But for Europeans, it's which is essentially quite a small geographical area of a lot of nation states, national sovereignty is very, very important. We've had that discussion in many ways in terms of the European Union. And I want to highlight one aspect to which actually, the West really isn't helping Ukraine. I think it's going to start becoming a bit of a debate. I mean, there are around 4.5 million, that's the Commission's statistics, there are about 4.5 million Ukrainians living in EU territory. They have something called a temporary protection, which is a special status, which means they're able to work. That legal status is ongoing until March 2026, so for quite a long time. That's a lot of people. That's 10% of Ukraine's population has gone to the EU. Many of those people, we don't really know how much, we know it's a lot, are working. And in fact, whole swathes of construction in Central and Eastern Europe, logistics all over Europe, are now staffed by Ukrainians. That's having a real impact on Ukraine's war effort, because quite a lot of those people are of fighting age, and quite a lot of those people have got their loyalties being divided by the prospects of living and working in the West. And we have to remember that, look at what that pull did to some countries that are in the European Union. Lithuania lost 30% of its population. After Ceausescu, Bulgaria has lost 28.2%, Romania 17.8%. So the EU itself, just in terms of its proximity and its openness to countries, actually saps their strength. It actually cuts the throat of many of these countries. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Baltic states, so go to a Baltics, if you go to a country like Lithuania, it is very sad. Lithuania is visibly populated. So that's no service. That's one way in which the West's help is actually destroying Ukraine.
Okay.